Start your day the Networking 101 way. You know, networking gear is pretty darn expensive, right? I mean, we spend a lot of cash on even the smallest items. So before we make one of those purchases, and we don't want to have what we call a resume generating event, right? We want to know how reliable that equipment is. When I put it in, how long is it going to last for? How do you know that? How do you know how reliable something is? So the first thing that any smiling sales rep and smiling SE is going to say is like, they're going to say, well, look at my MTBF, my mean time between failures, right? And it's usually some humongous number, right? It's like 200 gajillion hours. And you're like, that'll last forever, And, it's solid state gear. It's going to last a long time. But how realistic is 200 gajillion hours when it comes to equipment out there? Well, let's take a little walk down the MTB path here and figure out what is MTBF. Because obviously, if I've got a Cisco 3750 in my network and I've said that my MTBF is, 8 million hours on that device, which I don't have a clue what it is because I never pay attention to that number. And I'll tell you why you shouldn't either. Or you should pay attention to it, but here's how you actually do it. You do it in small pieces, right? So let's take me. Let's take me, for example. I'm 48 years old. Today, it's March 2014. So I'm 48 years old. And let's say there's 500,000 48-year-old dudes out there in the world today. Now, I'm sure there's probably a few more of us out there. And let's say that in a typical year that, if we went from March to March, that in that time span, about 625 of us are going to bite it, right? We're going to die off. Now, if we know that, we can actually just run some pretty quick calculations, and we can say that that typically amounts to about 0.125 folks out there as part of our sampling rating. Now, MTBF is the inverse of what our failure is. So now if I say that I take 1 over 0.00125, that's going to equal a grand total of what my MTBF is 800 years. Woohoo! 800 years lifespan. Is that realistic? You think I'm going to last 800 years? Because if I am, I'm bringing Networking 101 every day for 800 years, baby. But chances are, wishful thinking, that dog just don't hunt, right? So how do we make sense of that? When you know that the data is kind of silly. MTBF are real numbers. I mean, they've been around actually since the early 30s. And surprisingly enough, their pedigree is really good. Actually, Werner von Braun actually came up with the system. There's another dude, and I'm probably spelling this wrong, and I apologize. I think it's Perestroika. Was another dude that helped him out. I know I'm spelling that wrong, but this is the math guy who fed this to von Braun, and von Braun tuned it. But they're trying to figure out what made their rockets not work. And so he's like, hey, I got this way we can kind of figure this out. Being German, they're all pragmatic and stuff. And so they figured out this, and that's how long the MTBF, that idea, what is your predictive analysis of how that works, actually happens. Now, when you're looking at MTBF, a couple things to remember. Number one, those numbers are predicted, right? They're predicted statistic samples based upon what components that we use in a device. If I've got a switch, and my switch has a circuit board, it's got caps in it, capacitors, it's got resistors, it's got an ASIC, it's got a battery in it, what we're basically doing is we're taking all these little electronic items that we have, and we put them in groups. And we get a number, an MTBF score, usually from the manufacturer who makes these devices, and they'll tell us what their MTBF score is, and then we statistically add this up, and we come up with a composite number. That's why that number is massive, because you're adding all these factors in, and you're coming up with this huge number, like 200 million hours, and it looks impressive. The marketing people love MTBF because it just makes your stuff look like it's going to last forever. It's solid state. What's going to kill your solid state stuff? Power surges and dust. That's what's going to kill that stuff off. For the most part, it is going to run a very, very long time. 200 million hours? No. Because what we're doing is it's an estimate. Now, let's make this a lot more complicated. When you're looking at MTBF, just because I say MTBF and you say MTBF, that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Why? There's a bunch of ways to measure it, right? There's fault trees. There's what they call mil-spec 620. There's a whole different list of Markov. It's just ways to measure the score. There is no real honest-to-goodness industry standard. The one thing that everybody has agreed on is that MTBF is represented by the symbol theta. So you always see theta. Theta is a sum of some number, and it's going to come out here. So you'll typically see theta stated as your MTBF representation of how this works. But as an engineer who's made these composite scores, the one thing I'd like you to remember is two important things. If people start spouting off, no matter who it is, what MTBF is, a couple questions you need to ask. Number one, how did you calculate this score? I'm not saying tell me what your devices and all your groupings is. Typically, when you're looking at MTBF, we use what's called a bathtub. And a bathtub is basically the plot of when these devices are made. This is our norm. If I'm looking at, this is my plot scales on, this is my release date. That's my go-to-market. This is my DOA date when I'm actually going to kill this product off and not support it anymore. This is my operating span. That's why I call it the bathtub, right? As you release products, you go through different development cycles where you can do cost reductions and change the product inside. Everybody does it, just kind of how it is, because you get lower cost on products. Doesn't affect the performance at all. You just kind of actually make some little ordalts on these products and make them work. This operating scale is really where MTBF lives. If I release this product here, I'm not here yet, right? Makes sense. So I have to predict what that is. When I get through this cycle and I get close to here, then I know my actual numbers and I can do what's called an estimate. Estimate is accurate based upon what I've learned here. So if people are saying, well, my MTBF numbers are great and they're massive numbers, is it predict or is it estimate? One is obviously phenomenally more reliable than the other. That's why a lot of people like to use what's called mean time to fail. So that's another different measurement. We don't have time to get into that one. Just another one to kind of keep in mind. But this one's the one that's quoted on data sheets. Everybody does it out there the most. And the number's pretty astronomical. But more importantly, just remember it is an estimate. It's a statistical sampling of what we think it's going to be up here because we obviously haven't lived this long. So there we go. Remember, 800 years for a 48-year-old guy? Boy, it sure would be nice, wouldn't it? But that is that'd be like Highlander stuff, wouldn't it? Ooh, like Jimmy Ray is starring in Highlander. Anyway, so when you're looking at planning out any type of device, network equipment, yes, MTBF does have a place in a network to kind of understand it, because if I'm using cheap stuff and I'm grouping all that stuff together, my MTBF number should be low. It should be low. But again, there is no standard. So everybody can calculate this based upon what they're going to do. Everybody's got a mortgage to pay, so nobody's going to say, oh, my MTBF score is actually 80. They're going to figure out another way to actually bump that score up. Ask them how they're doing it. Compare apples to apples. If you're buying a Cisco device and you're buying another competitor device, ask each of us what MTBF method we use to calculate this to kind of get this number. Because in the end, it's your resume on the line and it's your network, it's your data on the line that really depends on reliability.